In this video, we'll learn about texture settings and TX Manager. Let's start with texture settings. I'm going to open up Render Settings window, and under the main tab, you have texture options. The first thing I want to do for now is to set TX generation mode to none. We come back to this later on. First, I want to make sure you understand what is MIP mapping. MIP mapping is an approach to texture mapping in which an original high-resolution texture map is scaled and filtered into multiple resolutions before it is applied to a surface. The texture can appear in full resolution and details if it is seen in a close-up, or can be rendered quickly and smoothly from a lower MIP level when the object appears smaller or further away. So when a texture is MIP mapped, it would be available for the engine in different resolutions, and based on how close or far we are from that texture, certain resolutions would be used. Formats like EXR, TIFF support MIP mapping, and formats like JPEG or PNG won't. All the textures that I have used in this scene are PNG or JPEG textures and unmipped or unmip mapped. If I open up the Asset TX Manager from the Arnold menu, we can see all the textures that are used in this scene, and as you can see, they are all JPEG or PNGs. Now we have accept unmipped. When enabled, Arnold will accept unmipped files and allow the render. If I uncheck accept unmipped and try to render, you can see the render will fail to start. We have auto MIP map. If a texture is not MIP mapped like the textures we are using in this scene, having this option enabled will generate a MIP map for that texture. So if you have a scene with tons of unmipped textures, having auto MIP map turned on will MIP map those textures, and it increases render time. We have accept untiled. So if the texture is not tiled and this option is enabled, Arnold allows the render, and if I disable it and attempt to render, because the textures in this scene are in PNG or JPEG and they do not support tile mode, the render will fail. So let's disable it and try to render our scene. And as you can see, the render failed error has appeared. And the reason the render fails is because in our diagnostics tab, we have abort on error enabled. If I disable it and render my scene again, you can see the scene is going to render, but we see this red color all over the place, which is the texture error color. Let's close the picture viewer and enable abort on error and get back to texture settings. We have auto tile. If enabled, Arnold will generate tiles for untiled textures in 64 by 64 pixel dimensions. You can change the tile size down here to whatever you want. Those tiles will be saved, and if just a certain part of the texture is visible in the render, Arnold will just uses those necessary tiles of the texture. This tiling process is gonna again increase render time when you are dealing with tons of high resolution untiled textures in your scene. So that's why in Arnold you should always, specifically when you are dealing with a lot of high resolution textures, use textures in formats that are MIP mapped and tiled, and those that are already saved in those texture files. Now the format Arnold suggests to use is .tx, which is Arnold's proprietary file format. Now .tx is basically EXR or TIFF files, which has been renamed to .tx files, but .tx has some extra attributes as well. Now let's talk about the TX generation process. If I right click on this TX generation option and reset it to default, you notice the default option is set to use preferences. If I press Ctrl E to open up Cinema 4D's preferences, you can do it from the edit menu as well, and come down to the Arnold section under the renderer, we get the same TX generation drop-down menu, which allows us to set the way we want the TX generation to happen globally. But if you want to control it per scene, you can use the TX generation menu in the render settings. Now the TX generation has three modes: none, manual, and auto. If set to none, when you start the render, .tx versions of your textures won't be created. If set to auto, the moment you start the render to the picture viewer, .tx versions of your textures will be created. And if set to manual, you can open up the TX Manager using this button here or from the Arnold menu. Select the textures that you want them to have a .tx version, and then press this Create TX button. For now, let me close the TX Manager. If I open up the text folder that contains the textures for this scene, you notice we don't have any .tx textures. The way the files are sorted out in this folder is in a way that if we had any .tx files, they will show up at the end of the list. If I set the TX generation mode to auto and start the render, you see down here in the status bar of the picture viewer, it says that Arnold is generating 9.tx files before starting the render. It takes a few seconds, and after the generation process is finished, the main render will start. If I get back to the text folder again, you see we have these new .tx versions of our textures. We still have the original textures in PNG or JPEG, but now we have generated .tx versions of them and made them available to Arnold. If I start the render again, you see the render will start immediately because those .tx files are already generated and accessible. Now, if I change the mode to manual and open up TX Manager, you see all of our textures have this TX indicator on the left side of them. If I select all the textures and click on this delete TX button, we are basically deleting .tx versions of our textures. Now the TX indicator has disappeared, and if I check out the text folder, you notice the .tx files are no longer here. Now the solution is simple. We can select all of the textures in the TX Manager and click on this Create TX button. Now it starts generating those .tx files again. And after a few moments, it's done and we get our .tx versions of our textures again. Now, to make sure Arnold actually uses these .tx versions of the textures instead of the original format, simply enable this replace textures with TX option. Now, the Asset TX Manager is a fairly complex window with a lot of great options. You can relink your missing textures or control the color spaces for your textures and so on. Everything is very self-explanatory and you can check all of it out on your own time. And we have been using this window a few times throughout the course to change texture color spaces and so on. Now, let me close the TX Manager and get back to the render settings. Max cache size is the maximum amount of memory used for caching the textures, so you can limit that memory here. Max open files is the maximum number of files that the texture system keeps open at any given time. It is set to 0, so there is no limitation, and the only one is your operating system limitations and the maximum number of open files that it can handle. So that's about texture settings and TX Manager. See you in the next video.